30 years ago, I stood in front of a comic shop advertising the death of Superman in its window display. That moment outside Heroes World set me on a path, a lifelong fan journey leading directly from that tattered red cape to this podcast. Now, together, we mine Superman's vast 85-year mythology by examining, discovering, and reconsidering the stories that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the Fleischer animated theatrical shorts from 1941 to 1943 is the editor-in-chief of 13th Dimension, returning guest, Dan Greenfield. Welcome back.
Hello, Anthony. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you back. It's funny, we'll get into this more as we go along, but we've touched on these Fleischer shorts here and there over the years on the podcast, but I was never really sure if I would do an entire episode devoted to it. And then very recently we had this remastered, restored Blu-ray release from Warner's. And of course, you've been covering it on your site, and it just kind of made it top of mind again. And it felt like a great opportunity to really dive in a way that I hadn't before, both personally as a Superman fan and on this podcast. So there's a few different things to unpack from the release itself to the shorts, and we'll get into all of it. But one quick bit of business, just to make sure everyone is on the same page here. So when we're talking about these 17 theatrical shorts, Dan and I are well aware. You knew where I was going with this. Dan and I are well aware the first 9 were produced by Max Fleischer, directed by Dave Fleischer through Fleischer Studios, the first 9. The remaining 8 were put out without Max and Dave through Famous Studios, the successor studio to Fleischer that was formed by Paramount. So when we kind of refer to these collectively as the Fleischers, we recognize that there is this delineation. And we'll talk about the differences between the episodes. But I just wanted to lay that out at the outset.
Well, thank you for pointing that out, because everybody, not everybody, actually, that's very much not true. A lot of people, like myself, refer to these just simply as the Fleischer Supermans. And I think that's just the standard that people refer to it, just like you think of a Band-Aid. You don't say, even if it's a different brand, you say, I'm going to go get a Band-Aid. Well, it's the same thing. These things are known as the Fleischer Superman. And yes, it's not all the Fleischer Superman, but we call it that. I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but for me, it's very simple. It's because they set the standard, they set the tone, and that tone was carried through, even though they were not directly involved in the second half of these, little movies, I guess you can call them. And when it comes to the differences, they are more noticeable toward the end as opposed to right when the transition took place. So, I always see this as of a piece. And as we will find out, I have learned, particularly when it comes to these cartoons, how pedantic some people can be. So there's that.
There's that whole piece of it, and one of the reasons why it was top of mind.
I'm picking at scabs here.
I understand. I was going through the articles on your site, 13thdimension.com, related to this release, and I was looking through some of the comments, and I saw a comment from preeminent Fleischer historian Ray Pointer. He was the one who mentioned this distinction, and I enjoyed your very succinct reply, which was yes.
Yes.
But the thing is, I guess I've experienced this as well, not even so much with this podcast, but with my Adventures of Superman rewatch podcast, which you've been a part of, where, there are different buckets of fans of that show. There are people who are a lot more casual and really don't know a ton about it, maybe haven't seen a lot of it or haven't seen a lot of it in a long time. And then there are the real ardent disciples of Adventures of Superman and the George Reeves depiction. And it's funny because I put out an episode recently and someone commented on YouTube, the show was in production from 1951 and 1953 to 1957. And I sat back and I was like, did I say otherwise? Like because I know that.
Yes.
Because I know that.
Yeah.
And I was like, I didn't even respond, but in my head I was like, if I said otherwise in the episode, I just misspoke because I do know when it was made. And
Yeah, I know.
if my guest said something otherwise and I didn't correct him, sorry. But again,
Yeah,
I appreciate people's passion. We all have it for various things, but I
yeah,
say all of this to be like, I get where you're coming from. And I was reading the comments and I'm like, I get it. I get it.
yeah. I mean, we can get into this later, but yeah, look, as we know, every single genre and genre within a genre and genre within a genre within a genre has its gatekeepers. And that, a lot of times that's helpful because, where would we get the information? Other times it can be very overbearing. That's the word I'll use. But onward.
Yes. Again, we'll circle back to that idea, I think, when we talk
Yeah,
about the
yeah.
reaction to this
Because
release. But
yeah, because it is relevant to this conversation about the quality of the new set. So and it's very much I think looking at these cartoons, you need to look at them in that context. But before we even get there, yeah, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, they're all good. We're on the same page here. We're all good here.
Yeah,
So yeah, we'll circle back to that idea, the response to the Blu-ray release and the technical quality of it. But yeah, before
right.
we get bogged down with that, let's talk about these shorts themselves. Now, another quick disclaimer: I'll probably at various points refer to these as episodes. I recognize, again, they're
I
theatrical
know.
shorts.
Same
In
thing.
my head, I'm always going to call them episodes, I'm sure.
Right.
But I guess my preliminary question, we always like to start with the personal component to all of this. So, kind of looking back on your tenure as, I know you're, again, far more of a Batman fan than a Superman fan, but as a Superman fan, as someone who consumes this sort of content, what has been your relationship, if any, with the Fleischer shorts before now?
Oh, very much. Yeah, I mean, they go back years. I didn't grow up with them. I knew that they had existed and I'd heard them referred to. And I don't think, I certainly didn't see them until I was an adult. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but they are very meaningful in my family. I mean, my son and I, it was, when we got one of those earlier transfers, earlier DVDs or whatever. This was among his earliest exposures to Superman, and I think the first thing I might have shown him was the Christopher. No, it wasn't. No, no, no. This is what it was. He had this was the first thing I'd shown him because he had a babysitter or he was at a babysitter's. And she says, "What do you want to do?" And he says, "I want to watch Superman." And what he meant was the Fleischers. And he was maybe 5. He's 24 now, so that gives you a little bit of a some perspective. And she's like, "Oh, really?" She's like, "Okay." So she puts on the Christopher Reeve movie, and he's like, "What is this?" He's like mind blown. So he like when we come pick him up, he's like, Dad, this is other Superman. I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I just didn't think you were ready for it yet. It's a long movie. I want to see it." That that sort of thing. So Fleischer's been in my house for about 20 years or so. Before that, I probably had seen bits and pieces, but I love these, and they're wonderful to sit and watch, and they're wonderful also to have on in the background. And if you're doing something else, and or if you're reading comics or whatever, and you want just a little atmosphere, it's just wonderful to have them on. They are everything that people say they are.
Very true. No, it's great to hear you describe all of that, and especially the experience with your son. Just the other
Yeah.
day, I took my son Milo, he'll be 4 in August. I took him to his first movie at the movie theater. We went to see Super Mario Brothers,
Oh,
and
there you go.
I didn't know if we'd make it all the way through because even at home,
Right.
he's typically not watching full movies. He'll watch episodes of Sesame
Right.
Street, but only once or twice have we actually sat down and watched the whole movie. So between the
Right.
the duration, the big screen, the sound, I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen here. We ended up having a private showing, which worked out great, and he
Wow.
was all in, and he was laughing, and he was so into it,
Oh,
and it
that's
was
great.
like that's a memory I'll cherish forever. It was so special, and
Yeah.
I grew up playing the Super Mario Brothers game, but it's not something that's been any kind of part of my life or fandom since. But
Sure.
I don't know. It probably will be now because now that memory is just associated with that first movie theater outing. I'll always hold that close.
You got more of them to come, buddy. That's the wonderful thing. I mean, look, we're recording this now, but just yesterday we drove an hour and a half upstate so we could be together to see Spider-Man across the Spider-Verse.
Ah,
We still share those things all these years later, and it's wonderful. And for us, Fleischers are those kinds of cartoons. There are certain things that Sam and I mean, we share a lot of the same interests anyway, but in terms of specifics, things that we connect on, and things that sometimes we just want to sit down and just hang out together. When he comes to visit or whatever, it's this is like one of the we have a few of the go tos. 1967 Spider-Man cartoons, we have this. We have some of the Batman the animated series, a lot of filmation. I mean, we have our go tos, and Fleischer's definitely there, and he knows as much about the Fleischers, if not more, than I do. Actually, we should have had him on.
right on. No, yeah, I know. Well, if he wants to ever send in some clips or something like that, we can do an addendum. But
Sure.
no, when you mentioned Filmation, I did, and I know you know this, I did pick up the recently released Blu-ray set of the Batman Filmation cartoons. Again, I don't
Yeah,
have,
they're
I do
great.
love, I do love Batman. I don't have the level of fandom you do, and I really don't have any connection to the Filmations. But I was just so pleased that they put this out because, of course,
Oh
Superman
yeah.
fan over here. I'm like, well, if this does well, hopefully this will motivate them to put out the Superman one. So I bought it and I did pop it in the Blu-ray player. And Milo watched a couple of them, and he was in the colors and the sound. He loved it. It was great.
Oh, it's yeah. I discovered them right around that age in syndication. Not to get too far off point. Um, of course, we're talking about Fleischer, so the quality is not the same, but the entertainment value is very close. And I'm a huge fan of the Fleischer superhero cartoons, and I'm also like you, waiting for them to remaster Superman. I don't know why I could never make heads or tails about when they make their decisions, why they make their decisions to what to remaster and what not. Aquaman made sense because of the movie. Batman came out of left field. Um, Maybe they're going to wait for the new Superman movie before they do it. I don't know. I got to figure it's on a checklist somewhere.
Yes. Well, fingers crossed on that.
Yeah.
Circling back to the question I had asked you about just history with Fleischer, I can't remember exactly when I first encountered these. At a minimum, it was probably earlier, but at a minimum, at the latest, it was when Warner Brothers put out that Superman movie anthology after Superman Returns, and it's been out on DVD and Blu-ray, and now I just bought the 4K set, which is still sealed, but I'll crack that open eventually. So at a minimum, I watched some of them there. But the thing about these shorts that I wanted to mention is that it's this weird thing where every time I've watched a couple, I have been so struck by all of the same things that everyone always talks about: the design, the Art Deco style, the fluidity of the motion, the dynamic action, the storytelling, the music. All of those things have always stood out to me. And you look at something like this, and it's astounding that it was made as long ago as it was because it still holds up and is
Oh yeah.
superior in terms of animation style and quality to a lot of things that have come since. Nevertheless, for whatever reason, every time I've watched one or two of these, I'm like, oh, I really need to watch all of them. And then I just kind of lose sight of it, and I don't finish them. So believe it or not, this is the first time I've actually watched all 17 of these.
Oh wow. See,
Yeah.
I've seen all of them multiple times, and so I have my favorites, ones that are go to that I just put on. Like for example, in preparation for this podcast, I watched Volcano back to back. I watched it the previously released version and the newly released version just to kind of get it in my head in terms of the differences and what have you. Because I absolutely love that one, and there's others that I'm just like, oh, I could watch this forever, and there are others that to me are a little slow. They just don't do it for me. They're a little routine. But yeah, I mean that's with anything. You have 17 segments, and not all of them are going to hold your attention. Some of them are going to be better than others. But I found, like I said, it's now I've seen them so many times now at this point, that I'm welcome to the club. I'm glad you've got to see gotten to see now all 17 because it is a treat.
For sure. Well, it's funny because again, like I said, for the podcast, I've watched some here and there. When we did our discussion of the Superman origins, I watched the first one, and I was struck as I was watching all of them now. They do replay that origin a couple more times in the famous studios era.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and then even when we covered something that's not a favorite of mine, but Superman Year One by Frank Miller and John Romita Jr., but they had talked
Right.
about Fleischer as somewhat of an inspiration, so I watched some there too. But yeah, this was the first time I sat down and watched them all. But going back to what I was saying at the top, I think one of the reasons why I was always a little bit unsure if I would devote a whole episode to this is that, again, in terms of the animation, it's absolutely gorgeous, but there's very little dialogue in most of these things. There's not, of course, any sort of ongoing narrative or arc. There's very little in terms of any kind of character development, and even in terms of that interpersonal play, it's very limited to essentially like those basic archetypes of the characters and
Yes.
how they relate to each other. Clark is meek and easily dismissed, and Lois is quite feisty and quite a go-getter, and certainly more
Yeah.
taken with Superman. And that's our basic setup, and that's all it needs to be. But I kind of always felt like, well, how much will I really have to say about this? But again, I think the time had come to kind of dive into this more fully.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, these are not character studies. No, these are just, it's just action, for as long as it takes. There's quick setup. I mean, if they have a formula, that's it. Quick setup, a lot of action, peril for Superman, peril for Lois. Superman overcomes it, saves Lois, finishes up, wraps up the job, and on we go. And somebody makes a cute comment at the end, and it fades out to the theme, and the end. And and yes, you're right. If I'm looking for something a little bit meatier in terms of storytelling, yeah, I'll put something else on. But what I do love about this, and what I think carries these, is that despite and I'm not even going to call them shortcomings. It's just they are what they are. Is that the animation is just so beautiful, and the music is so much fun to listen to, and everything about them for me. Again, it might be a mood. Maybe I'm not in the mood to watch them sometimes, but I appreciate them for what they are. And when you consider when they were made, which was only a few years after Superman was even created. I mean, let's not forget that 1941 was only 3 years after Superman appeared. And so, especially when you're that they're going for a younger audience at the movie theater. This is shorts that they had. They always had cartoon shorts, but Superman was going to appeal to everybody, and kids. They weren't thinking. I don't think about, like, character development or anything like that. It's just, let's show them a lot of really cool action, and it's all about the animation style, and it's all about the atmosphere, and the set pieces. Like I was talking about Volcano just before, the whole sequence when things go, and they're going to, it's like when all of a sudden the volcano starts to blow. I mean, from that point until the end, it's mesmerizing. There's just all of the reds and yellows and oranges, and the movement of the lava, and the explosions, and like you mentioned, the movement of the characters. It's a great version of that when you see that a lot of those shots in that cartoon are wide shots. You see Superman and Lois from a distance, and they're showing you this whole tableau of what's going on around them. So their whole point was spectacle. Their whole point was showing the action, and something that actually you would that would given that it was in color, given that it was in movie theaters, in a lot of respects, the special effects were better in this than anything that you would actually see in a live action movie at the time. So I think that's really what they were going for, and of course, nobody at that time was thinking about character development in comic books and comic book characters in the comic books themselves. I mean, most of those characters in comic books in the 40s they're ciphers, except with the exception of the archetypal, Clark Kent, because he had a very specific shtick. But all the boom of superheroes that followed, with the exception of maybe Captain Marvel, and yeah, there are others that I'm sure obscure ones, but you take most of the other square-jawed heroes, and their personalities are pretty much the same. It's just whatever the circumstances are that change. Bruce Wayne would be as interchangeable with Jay Garrick as interchangeable with Carter Hall, in my opinion. Now, I know you're likely to get messages saying, no, 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 that's not true. And you get my point. Um, so for me, the fact that they are what they are, I just take them on their own terms.
No, that's the thing. Your points are all well taken. And even for myself, again, it wasn't, and again, use the perfect word. I didn't even look at that as a shortcoming myself. It was more just, again, would I have as much to say about it? But no, like I agree. I think
Right.
these were exactly what they needed to be. And it's funny because we're talking about the distinction between the two sets of shorts, and we can talk more obviously as we get deeper into it. But one of the things that I felt within that second batch, the famous studios era, there are the war propaganda pieces, and
Right.
then there are the more I don't know, mundane metropolis set stories. But I felt like in the famous era, there was a little bit more time put into the setup, and not as much in the way of the spectacle of the main set piece, the way that we got in the first batch. And I don't think that they hold up as well, in part for that reason. I mean, I think that what the Fleischers did in that first round, and I think in part because they weren't concerned with the character studies or anything like that. I think that helps add to the timelessness of all of this.
Yes.
And to your other point, I agree. That's the other thing that I always go back to with these is just how early in the mythology and the history these came. And yeah, it was only a few years after. It's really quite astounding. I never I don't mean to always beat up on the Kirk Allen movie serials, but you look at those Kirk Allen serials, as I have done fairly recently, and from a historical perspective, they're really fascinating to look at, and you have to give them a ton of credit for being the first
Oh
live
yeah,
action take on the character and all of that,
sure.
and clearly set the template for what would become Adventures of Superman down
Right.
the line. So credit where credit's due, but at the same time, I can't really watch them without grading them on a curve, so to speak. Whereas I can
Oh,
look at
absolutely.
but I can look at these Fleischers and just enjoy them in and of themselves for what they are because they still hold up in a really powerful way.
Oh, absolutely. This is foundational stuff, Anthony. I mean, we're this is to me this is as essential Superman viewing as anything else. And I don't think that even is an argument. I mean, I think there are certain things. I mean, look, we know that. I mean, this was the show or show. It's same thing. I call it that because of the way I experience it, but it was not a show. It was a series of you know. Don't hate me, folks. I'm going to just use shorthand from here on out. Anyway, so when you look at these and you look at these what did they do? Superman flew because of these, because the animators said it's easier to make him fly than to jump around. It looks like a grasshopper, and it's true because you see some of the episodes that he's jumping around and it looks kind of silly, but when he flies, it's like that's fabulous. That is great. And the it's just, to me, if you're gonna get a well-rounded super experience in terms of screen versions of Superman, to me this is where you start. Now, I don't mean you necessarily need to watch them in order to appreciate all the different screen versions of Superman, but my point is that this is essential viewing. I mean, this isn't even, to me, like an additive. This is part and parcel of the whole Superman culture.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't disagree with that at all. And yeah, for anyone, I mean, it's funny. I guess I kind of assume all people have seen it, and for anyone who hasn't, or if you haven't seen all of them, like myself, until recently, I can't recommend them enough. It's
Oh
definitely
yeah,
worth the time to go through everything. So it's funny you mentioned about Superman flying. Now I know this has become the narrative around Fleischer. This is where Superman first flew.
right.
Not to split hairs and put on
No,
my
I
nerd
know,
hat, but it's funny
I
too
know.
because I was digging around on this, and there are some articles on Superman homepage and CBR about when did Superman actually first fly. So there was
Right,
Superman number 10, where it was an artist error who drew Superman like
right.
floating around for various pages when at that time he was only leaping. Superman homepage also dug up, and I forget the title off the top of my head, but it was like a British magazine from 1939, and on the cover was Superman essentially flying towards space. That's again a very specific isolated instance. But I think most importantly on the radio show. And I have
Yeah.
listened to those first few episodes where they go through Superman's origin, and we've talked about this before, how wonky it was. He comes out of the rocket fully grown in the Superman costume. It was a different take, but he comes out and he's flying, he's floating, above wherever he is. So he had flown before, but I do think it's fair to say that the Fleischers solidified and popularized the idea of Superman flying. I think that's more than fair to say.
Fair enough. I'll go with that. I concur.
Now, going back to this narrative around the Fleischers, there are certain talking points that kind of always come up when we talk about Fleischer. And on the one hand, it's been covered, but at the same time, I don't know that a conversation would be complete without it. So in terms of how these came to be, right, Paramount had acquired the film rights from National for Superman, and they were interested in bringing Superman to the big screen. And they came to the Fleischers, Max and Dave Fleischer, in their animation studio, which at that point had been set up down in Florida. And at that point, they were primarily known for Betty Boop and Popeye, and they had recently invested a ton of time and money in a animated theatrical film, Gulliver's Travels, which, as I understand it, was met with somewhat middling success. And so I think that kind of put them off a little bit when they were approached to do these Superman pieces. And so as the story goes, they quoted an astronomically high figure, $100,000, which is like $1.5 million in today's standards, vastly more than the going rate at the time, figuring that Paramount would be like, all right, forget it. But instead, they negotiated. I feel like sometimes the shorter version of the story is they're just like, okay, eventually they did negotiate down, and the first short cost $50,000, and the remaining ones cost $30,000 a piece. But still, a very, very high figure. Yeah, for 1941. So, and they also took a long time. Each one took about 6 months to make.
Yeah.
And again, some of this was mentioned in the special features that are on the Blu-ray. Others came across on Wikipedia. But a lot of this stuff, I was digging through my Superman versus Hollywood book, that by Jake Rosen, which came out many years ago. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but it was on the shelf. And then Larry Tye's Superman history book as well. I was looking through that. They had not a ton of space on Fleischer, but enough. And there were those are some of the pieces that kind of came up. And so again, each one was 10 minutes, which was the length of one reel. And again, we had the Fleischer shorts, the first 9 from September 1941 through August 1942. And then the famous studio shorts, numbers 10 through 17, from September 1942 through July 1943. The Jake Rosen Superman versus Hollywood book had some really wild background on how Fleischer Studios became famous studios. Are you familiar with any of this? Yeah,
I am, but it would be good to, I think, give a short version for the listeners. So by all means, go ahead.
Sure. So I guess there were a couple of things at play. On the one hand, there was the breakdown in the relationship between the brothers. And the book also mentioned that one of their other brothers invented the claw game, the arcade claw game.
Oh, really? That's something I didn't know. There you go. The basics of popular culture right there.
Going back to that movie outing we went to Alamo Draft House, and they have one of those machines.
Oh.
And when we
came
And when we came out of the movie, he was like, oh, can we do this? And we had gone to this indoor water park a little while back, and they had a huge arcade, and we did everything, including the claw game. And did I try? And I was so close, and I kept losing it every time. So we came out of the movie. I was like, let's do something else. I didn't have it in me.
It's because the claw game is 3-card Monty. I mean, I've never known anybody to win the claw game.
Yeah, you just can't win. But so there was the breakdown in the relationship between the brothers. They were also in debt. And they had also borrowed money from Paramount, and Paramount called in that debt. Now, according to this Superman versus Hollywood book, there was this contract between them which gave the Fleischers, I believe it was 10 years to repay the debt, but Paramount called it in. And apparently, and this was the really wild part, that while one of the brothers was at a meeting with Paramount, the Fleischer offices were ransacked, and a lot of important documentation went missing, such that they had no way to prove that they had 10 years to repay this debt. And Paramount then seized the opportunity to take over and that's when it became Famous Studios. And I guess a lot of the animators stayed on, but again, of course, it was without the involvement of Max and Dave specifically. And they clearly were such pioneers in the field. And I believe it was Max in particular who really had the scientific mind and had developed the process of rotoscoping, where you're tracing
Rotoscoping.
over live action footage. So, but yeah, that backstory with Paramount and some of the allegedly shady practices, to put it mildly, was pretty interesting. I wasn't aware of that piece of it.
Yeah, old school Hollywood, man. More
Yeah,
things change, more they stay the same.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And yeah, and again, you
Yeah.
think about how much went on that you would just have no idea of knowing. All
Right.
right, especially at that
Right.
time. So
Yep.
I guess that's some of the background on it. Is there anything else kind of from that side of it that we haven't hit on that you think would be worth discussing?
I mean, other than uh, you know, no, I mean, I think that really does cover it. I mean, there is interesting reading out there on the background of how these were made, and the limitations, and the relationship with Paramount and what happened. And there are some people who think that there is a clear quality difference between the two studios. I find that to be uh, overstated, because I actually do find that the famous ones are in large measure, except for a couple toward the end. I think a lot, I mean, I look at something like the 11th Hour, which is, an episode which is later in the run, 12th in the run, I guess. And to me, I find that an astonishing piece of animation. The movement, the mood, the characters. Now, we haven't gotten into the whole racial depiction that is deeply problematic, and are an issue, and it is worth discussing. But from just looking from a sheer artistic standpoint, I look at the 11th Hour and I'm blown away. Just when you all of the things that you take for granted when you're watching animation, because to me, I still actually, I have to admit this, I don't really still know how animation works. I still think it's like magic, that somehow people draw pictures and they move. And I know it's really hard, and I know that especially back then when they didn't have computers. But that's my point, is that you watch all of these and every single thing was done by hand. I mean, it's just, even involving rotoscoping, it's painstaking work that went into these. And the same, in my mind, when I look at something like the 11th Hour, I think is of similar quality of anything else, because the way Superman pulls the chains, the way the boats sink into the harbor, all of the scaffolding and the way that it breaks, and the movement, the characters, the way the characters move, and it's true to life movement, that fluidity, and the lighting and the colors, and it's an astounding piece of animation. And I don't care if it's Fleischer or Famous. To me, it's of a piece.
Fair. So I would say I mostly agree with you. I don't feel like, well, how do I put it? I'll put it this way. I feel like it is appropriate to talk about these as a piece. I don't see such a distinction where I feel like,
No,
hey, they really should have put out two separate Blu-ray releases and we should have two separate
right.
episodes. No, I do think they're worth talking about together. I think in terms of the animation, there were a few things that I noticed in the second batch. For example, Superman's belt, they like lost the belt in a lot of instances,
Yeah,
and it looks off. And there was one in Showdown where there's the imposter Superman, and Superman eventually confronts the guy who's behind it, and they have the trap door and he's falling. And it just
right.
I don't think it hit the highs of the original ones, but there is still a lot of good stuff in there. And it's funny because story-wise, putting aside the problematic racial depictions, and Warner's
Yeah,
even put a disclaimer on the Blu-ray in
yeah,
front of those
yeah,
installments, right? So there's
yeah.
Japators where these
Which they
Japanese,
should.
yeah,
And just as a quick aside, if I may, I'm glad that they did re-release them, and re-release them with the disclaimer, as opposed to putting out a sanitized version that buried the past. I am a firm believer in that. I mean, I really, really think that art is art, and even if it's commercial art, it should be seen in the context of the times in which it was created. And I know that that's a sensitive issue. I don't mean to be glib about it, but I would much rather see for myself what these are. And I like the disclaimer notion as opposed to just simply, we're just not going to re-release these. And it is not, these are, for the reasons we're discussing, there are a number of episodes that are difficult to watch because of that. I mean, I won't watch Jungle Drums. It's one I just skip over. It's like, it's too much. And it's it's just wrong. It's just plain wrong. And I understand the propagandistic nature of the I mean, when we're talking about the Nazis, they don't there's no racial issue there at all. They're just, evil Nazis. Um, it's the Japanese where you're talking, really stereotypical visuals and behaviors, and it's really hard to get past that. But I do watch these in the context of the time, and frankly, I'm fascinated by World War II culture anyway. And you watch old Bugs Bunny cartoons, and they were filled with propaganda. There's so much of that was part of the time, and I think that that's part of the experience. And it is a warts and all approach. And it's just something I'm glad that Warner Discovery, or whatever they're called now. I'm glad that they decided to take this approach as opposed to just simply burying it in the sand.
Totally. No, that's the thing. I agree. I think that a disclaimer is the appropriate step. This is
Yeah.
part of our history. This is part of Superman history. And so
Yeah.
and I don't even, and the thing is, I don't even know how you would try to sanitize these because it's so baked
You can't.
into these installments. So if that
Yeah.
means
You can't.
whatever measure they would take or simply excising them, I don't think that's the right step because they exist and they shouldn't be ignored. You have to look at them and you have to, again, understand the context, understand clearly
Yeah.
that, wasn't, and that's what the disclaimer essentially says, that it wasn't right then and it wasn't right now and it doesn't reflect,
Right. Exactly.
their position and all that. On a related note, on the George Reeves podcast, the most recent episode that I covered, or well, not based on this recording, was Drums of Death.
Look, not to go off point, but you and I talked about this offline. Drums of Death is a marvelously entertaining episode. It doesn't hold up for anything to me. I mean, if you look at it too closely, there are all sorts of holes in the plot. But it's really great old school pulp. But its depiction of, I mean, its depiction of black people, and uh, it's beyond problematic. The use of blackface. It's actually disturbing to watch the episode. So it's a really weird exercise in looking at something as entertainment versus something that's socio-political, and it fails on every socio-political score. But as entertainment, like old fashioned entertainment, it still works. But then you feel ashamed, or at least I do, for even thinking of it in those terms. So it's very, very complicated. And I do look at this as like, I'm Jewish, okay? How would I feel if they were using Jewish stereotypes in these circumstances? And the only thing I can say to that is I would have to see it and judge for myself rather than make a blanket declaration that I would not want to see it. But it's like looking at Jungle Drums here, where it's like I can't even watch it. It's too much, And but with the 11th Hour, I could look at that one in the context, because it's not a Superman adventure as much as it is a propaganda film. I mean, that's what it is. It is meant to rally, kids and adults, and isn't it great that we've got a hero who can fight for right and against and let's not also forget that when something like 11th Hour first, November 20th, 1942, not only were we in the thick of World War II, but it was less than a year after Pearl Harbor. So you cannot dissociate the two. So I think that this is something, it's very complicated, and I certainly don't have all the answers when it comes to this, but I am a believer in putting something in its historical context and looking at it that way as opposed to just simply ignoring it. I think that it goes to the old adage, which is true, and we are seeing it around us. Not to go political, but those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And I really believe that it was the same thing a few years ago when DC Comics was going to reprint all of the Detective Comics before Batman showed up, and it was going to be this 2-volume slipcover hardcover. I thought this is wonderful. What an archival, interesting thing to do. And they put the kibosh on it because it had occurred to them, or somebody had pointed it out, or something, that there were problematic depictions in the cartoon, in the comics. And I thought to myself, well, I would much rather it exist with essays, and it's sort of like what TCM does when you show these old films that have these depictions. Then have an introduction, have a discussion, explain what was going on in the world, address the elephant in the room, that this is wrong, that it was wrong then, that it's wrong now, while at the same time being able to look at the artistry and understand the world in which this was developed. And if you just simply bury all of that, then you don't learn. And anyway, I just on the whole, when it comes to art in particular, I'm a believer in giving the viewer, the reader, whatever, the listener, the historical context of what we're talking about, because 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we're going to be judged harshly too. That's assuming that we're all here, and you think about what was being done 80 years ago. It was a different world, a much uglier world too. People think of the good old days. Well, I don't think living in the middle of a world war and in a country that was riven with racial prejudices is the good old days. But there are parts of it that they are what they are. And
That's the thing. It's my position, and this, kind of bringing it back to the Adventures of Superman bit. My position on that show in particular, when we've encountered instances like in Drums of Death, has been I've been putting it in terms of neither condemning nor condoning, but acknowledging,
right,
recognizing,
right,
recognizing.
exactly, yeah.
And because I think if you, again, in particular, if you are simply ignoring it or taking it out, then there's nothing to learn from that, right? So I am a fan of the disclaimer if we're going to do something. Much more recently, episodes, not to take us too far afield, but it is relevant to what we're
Right.
talking about.
Sure.
Episodes of some of my favorite television shows were pulled from streaming services because they included instances of blackface. Episodes of Scrubs, Always Sunny, 30 Rock, The Office. And I felt like, hey, I think a disclaimer would have been the better step
Yes.
as opposed to simply taking it away. But with Drums of Death, and then I'll leave that episode alone, we talked about it in our discussion, obviously. And again, my position really was exactly what I just said, just kind of acknowledging it. My feeling, I don't think we dwelled on it. I don't think we bashed the episode unfairly or unnecessarily. Yet I had comments on YouTube saying, "Don't rewrite history." Someone wrote, it might have been the same person, "Just enjoy the takeoffs and landings on the show." Well,
I don't think that you can. I think you have to. I think you have to acknowledge it. And for me, the reason I say, and look, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because you can't win. There's always going to be people who are going to see it a different way, and I understand that. And I also understand that I'm coming at this from the perspective of being a middle-aged white guy. Okay, I acknowledge that too. But when I look at something like, for me, the distinction between looking at an 11th hour, which is about wartime and is a very specific reason for that existing. I look at Jungle Drums, on the other hand, and I see that, and I see the depiction of black people who are not, they're not, we're not fighting, a war against Africans, and they're just depicted as pretty much subhuman. The stereotypes of the body shapes and the physicality, and a lot, it's ugly.
yep.
And I can't watch it. Others might be able to. I personally cannot. 11th hour, because of the nature and the context if I were Japanese or Japanese American, I'm sure I wouldn't like it, but at least I do understand why it existed at the time. It doesn't condone it, but I have to acknowledge it. And what your takeaway is going to be what your experience and what your life experience is. And I don't say this with any kind of sense of absolutism, because there are readers or listeners out there who are going to think I'm 100% wrong about this, and I understand that. But I just this comes down to the when it comes to art, the classic separating the art from the artist and the times. And I don't think there's a cut and dried answer. I think it's very complicated.
Yeah, no, for sure. And all of this to say that with the putting aside those problematic depictions of certain people
Yeah.
in the episodes and the shorts,
And they are. I
they
mean,
yeah,
that's the thing. Let's not get past that. They are problematic. It's yeah, not good.
right. But that aside, I did find those World War II centric shorts to be the more interesting ones within
Yeah.
that second batch from Famous Studios. So the
Yeah.
first one, we have Japanese saboteurs hijacking an American bomber plane. That does lead to, I would say, probably one of the best, if not the best, Famous Studio set pieces of Superman catching the plane and landing it on the
The
street. I
plane.
thought that was awesome.
Yeah. The way he lands it on the streets of Metropolis and figures out a way to do it so that the wings go off into the side street and the fuselage is on the avenue. It's like brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. And the way that they show that, and I'm glad we're getting back to talking about actually the cartoons themselves, but that scene where he's like flying around catching this part, then he goes over to catch this part and he eases it down, and how he manages to do that is it's magical. It really it's, and this is what I'm saying is that I would rather be able to have all of the experiences and understand that rather than not to be able to see that at all. And I don't know, maybe that's being simplistic. I don't think it is, because I don't think any of this is simple.
Yeah, and also, one thing that I always keep in mind, I'm sure it's in your head too as you're watching these. We experience them in a different way, but you think about
Yeah.
even putting these specific shorts aside, but just these
Right.
animated shorts all together, kids and adults going to the theater and seeing these on a
Right.
big screen
Yeah.
in the early 40s when the character was still in his infancy, and how
Yeah.
formative this was in shaping the way people saw the character and what he could do. And so, kind of always keeping in mind what that experience was like and how it was informed by what was on the screen, for better or worse. So yeah, we take it all
Right.
in. And that set piece and that first Famous Studios one was really interesting. Yeah, 11th Hour, you've mentioned a bunch of times. That was a standout as well, where Lois and Clark are interned in Japan, and then Clark is sneaking out every night as Superman and sabotaging the Japanese war effort. And this was an interesting piece, because we had talked about, when you came on the George Reeves show, we talked about the stolen costume, and the whole setup there was Clark had left his costume at home because he was going for a physical, and we talked about how would he get through a physical. And you
Right.
referenced that Golden Age Superman story where Clark is going to enlist to go over to fight in World War II, but
Yeah.
his powers actually work against him. He uses his X-ray vision inadvertently, and he's reading the eye chart from the next room or behind that page or whatever it was.
It's one of the great it's one of the great explanations of why Superman didn't go to war. I love that whole idea.
As do I, and certainly that was a great explanation in the comics for why is Superman not intervening and not doing this. But here you got to see him behind enemy lines and really
Yeah.
getting into it, and so it was
Yeah.
just a different dynamic, and
And it's
certainly
like
you can see
noir
why. Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's espionage. It's sabotage. And it just it is a wonderfully atmospheric 10 minutes. And again, look. I'm not going to go back down the road we just went down. But judging it on artistic terms alone, I find 11th Hour to be an amazing 10 minutes of animation. I am just stunned by the way that one's put together. And the colors, and when you see Superman flying and it's all red on the screen because it's the skies are red because of the explosions, and again, the way when he yanks the ships into the harbor, the way the ships move, and you even see the wide shots where the Japanese soldiers are putting up battlements to get ready for Superman, and the way even the tiny little characters. There's one scene where there's like a platoon of soldiers, and you've got one guy standing over them, pointing out and giving orders, and he's shaking his head no. And these are tiny little characters on the screen, and you realize that the level of detail that they were going for is that you cannot deny the artistry behind that. The painstaking work that required to do is a mind blower. And I look at that and I have to balance that against its negatives, but I also have to recognize that it's beautiful work. It's just plain beautiful animation.
It is. And talking about the animation and maybe kind of returning to some of the earlier ones, especially those first nine, which leaned far more into sci-fi as opposed to, again, a lot of the war propaganda pieces that we would get in the second batch, or even the ones that weren't war propaganda. But for example, the one with Superman's imposter who's going around committing crimes. Those
Right.
first nine really did lean into the sci-fi aspect. We had mad
Yeah.
scientists. We had the mechanical monsters, science gone awry. Also, natural disasters. We had, albeit a man-made one, but an earthquake. We had the volcano. We had
Volcano's great.
the runaway gorilla. So not sci-fi, but just a fun, just a fun
Terror
one.
on the Midway. Yeah.
The Arctic Giant, which I haven't shown my son any of these yet, but that's the one that I think he would be excited to see Superman fighting a giant dinosaur, essentially.
It's Superman versus Godzilla is what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the fact that it's they're and that's the other things like there are little things in there about how little we knew about science, relatively speaking. That when you see the episode with the Arctic Giant, it says Tyrannosaurus Rex, habitat Siberia, and it's like however many years ago, and it's like way off. I mean, it's like it says something like 2000 BC or something ridiculous like that. And he doesn't look like a Tyrannosaurus at all. He basically looks like a what we used to call a brontosaurus, but with teeth. But it's still fun to watch because who wouldn't want to watch a complete movie of Superman versus Godzilla? Who wouldn't want to watch that?
No, for sure. And in that episode and many others, and what you were just saying a moment ago prompted this, they did such an amazing job of capturing the scale of everything. Because when Superman
Yeah,
is going up against the giant, he looks small, next
yeah,
to it.
yeah,
And similarly, you mentioned the wide shots and the amount of crowd scenes you get, and
yeah.
the amount of the cityscape that you see, and the
The
detail.
architecture of the city. Yeah,
Absolutely. And again, I just keep going back to this idea they could have, for lack of a better term, gotten away with doing a lot less, right? Especially this was the first time Superman's being put on screen. Whatever it had been, people would have been like, "Oh, look, it's Superman." But the amount of effort and detail that they put into this, again, accounts for why it still holds up. But it's just so remarkable.
yeah. But also that was, I mean, these were professional animators, and what animation was expensive. I mean, if you look at the Disney movies of the time, and again, we've become so accustomed to animation and what can be done with it, and even the old Disney movies. But when you take a step back and you look at something like Fantasia, and you look at something like Snow White, and I mean, look, the Fleischers are wonderful, but those are on a whole other level. And so this was expensive, but it wasn't even Disney level. And you look at the kind of quality, the kind of effort that was going into this, and how much it had changed within 20 years. Because by the 60s, animation had gotten a whole lot cheaper. You saw what Hanna and Barbera was doing and what Filmation were doing, which I love for their, on their own terms. They're a different thing. You also have Warner Brothers in between with all the Bugs Bunny shorts, which also were wonderfully animated and wonderfully drawn. But as they went along, they also went cheaper too with some of the backgrounds and a lot of the things that you did. A lot of the stuff that you saw in the early Bugs Bunny segments you didn't see in the later ones. Doesn't make them any less funny though, because because Bugs Bunny is never not funny.
No, for sure. We talked about how maybe this wasn't Superman's actual first flight, but it still went a long way towards popularizing the
Sure.
idea of Superman flying, solidifying that as part of his power
Yeah.
set. As far as his powers generally in this, though, this is a pretty modestly powered, stripped down, golden age incarnation of the character. He's strong,
Yeah.
he flies, he uses X ray vision once in the Mechanical Monsters installment.
Right.
And that's essentially it. I guess you could say he's fast, but even then, it's nowhere near the super speed that we equate with the character now. So, I mean, it's essentially he's strong and he flies and he sweats. That's the
Yeah.
thing that, and clearly you see in a variety of respects, the style and this respect as well, the influence on the DC animated universe and what Bruce Timm and company
Oh, yeah.
were able to pull from this. But that was one of the things in revisiting Superman the animated series not too long ago. I was able to appreciate even more as an adult was how that Superman similarly would sweat and would struggle. And you see that
Right.
here. I think my favorite one out of all 17 was the $1 Billion Limited, Superman versus the Runaway Train. And I thought it was just such an awesome set piece. And when he's hauling that train and the robbers are throwing the tear gas at him and he's coughing and he's stumbling and his hair is messy, that was one thing, whether it was an instance like that or when he's underwater, the detail of having his hair move as if it is underwater or it's being tussled or whatever. So impressive. It was that detail that just really made it sing. But I love that one. That's probably my favorite.
Yeah. See, going back to Volcano, another issue where there's a wide shot, and you see Lois basically either falling or jumping from a cable to the cable car itself before it all explodes, falls apart, and but you see her land, and you see her hair go up as she lands, and the actual movement is true to life. Now I know that there's rotoscoping involved, but I don't care. That's still a wonderful technique. It's still when you see her also running around trying to avoid the lava and trying to run up the stairs, and you see her going back and forth, and the way her body moves, and she pauses and then she turns the other way, that they were able to capture that is striking. And in a lot of respects, it's still better than any kind of cartoon you're going to see today, if you're going to make the distinction between hand drawn and animation. I mean, I just saw the new Spider-Man movie just yesterday, and mind-blowingly good. I mean, it is a marvelous movie, and the visual experience is about as far away from Fleischer as you can get, and they are both wonderful works of art in their own context. But I can never get away from the fact that the Fleischer stuff was all done by hand, painstakingly, frame by frame. And when you see these little details and you notice them, especially for me, in the new versions that have come out, it is amazing to see the level of detail that, for me, in the older transfers, there's even more there than I'd realized. There are things that to me, this is watching the new ones. It's a different experience, but to me, it's an enhanced experience. But we can get to that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I do want to get into that, but there were a few other things that Fleischer did add, truly added to the Superman mythology. One of them was the Daily Planet globe,
Yeah,
right?
and
We
it's
got our first
great, and
instance.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. I like Chief. I don't know if they ever call him Perry or not, or if they just call him Chief,
They call him
because it
Mr.
might
White.
also
Clark calls him Mr. White at least once, but it's mostly
he
Chief.
does. Okay. Yeah. So because also I don't know exactly when the distinction was made between George Taylor, the original editor of the Daily Star, and when it became Perry White and all of that. But I will say this, as someone who has spent a lot of his years in newsrooms, that the Perry's finest moment is when he sends Lois and Clark down to the volcano, and he says, "Come back and bring me some real stories." And I'm going to tell you how many times I have heard that sentence from an editor's mouth, including from my own, as if the reporters aren't going to go and do that anyway. They're not going there and there for a vacation. They know their assignment. They are really good at what they do, but the editor still has to say, "Bring me some real stories." So I'm like, well, that's at least that's what it's like in real life. It's silly but true.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that your favorite Perry moment in this was when Lois and Clark come back from their Birdman
Oh, I
adventure
know,
where
and he
they're down in the
burns the
caves and he
story.
burns up the story.
Yeah, that's his worst moment. I like Terry, man. That or Perry. That's bad. You know, you've got all of the you have all of this. And what's great, just as a quick aside, also that I noticed on the new transfer that I'd never noticed before, that when you actually see Perry reading through the story, they took the time. It's not, the term for like if you show a newspaper with a headline and then all of the other writing underneath it is just garble. That's called Greek because it's, basically you don't understand it. It doesn't look like, and it's, I don't know where that term came from, but that's. But anyway, they actually took the time to write the story that Lois wrote. You actually, if you stop the frame, it's a description of what we had just seen, and it's not the script. It's actually a written out narrative of, and it's like I'm like, oh my god, and it's typewritten, and you only see it for half a second, and then he burns it, and I'm like, they went through that much trouble to just. They didn't have to do that. And how great is that they did that? But yeah, Perry, bad move, man. That's not a journalist's pioneering spirit. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah, I get the whole thing. I guess they didn't have evidence, but they have 3 eyewitness accounts. Maybe they could go back and dig through some of that rubble and get some evidence. It
Well, it
felt
would have been
like,
good if maybe Jimmy. They didn't have Jimmy on this show, but it would have been good to have a photographer with them.
yes, that indeed that would have helped. But yeah, we get the first Daily Planet Globe, and we also get in that opening, setup for the show, the faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than
Yep.
a locomotive.
Yeah.
They tried a different version later on, faster than a streak of lightning,
Yeah.
right? More
They
powerful.
mix it up a few times. Yeah. More powerful than the pounding surf.
Yeah. Mightier
Yeah.
than a hurricane, something to that
Mightier,
effect.
yeah, than a roaring hurricane. Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't. The original is still the best. But
Yeah.
then I think that they got all that from the radio show too. I think that was like the same because it's Jackson Beck who's the voices on the show are the same that were on the radio show,
Yeah.
and the
Bud
theme
Collyer,
is the
Joan
same theme that
Alexander.
they used on the radio show. So I leave it to better super minds than mine to tell me which came first.
My
Rather than
understanding is that I believe the whole look up in the sky. I think that came from the radio show, but I'm almost certain that the
right.
faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a
Okay.
locomotive was Fleischer, and then that
Well,
stuck.
there you go.
But yeah,
Yeah.
clearly the
And also,
second iteration didn't.
no, but and also my understanding is that the idea of him switching his costume in a
Phone
phone
booth.
booth came from Fleischer too. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And again, I know we just mentioned so Bud Collyer as Clark and Superman, and Joan Alexander
yeah,
as Lois, both from the radio show, and again,
yeah,
just that classic. This looks like a job for Superman, and
yeah.
it really does go a long
100%.
way. And you don't get a lot. Again, there's not much dialogue. We're talking about the voice actors. There's not a lot of dialogue, but that's definitely a standout moment.
Yeah,
One thing that I wanted to ask you because this was interesting to me, and very recently I mentioned this on the show, but I wrote an article for your site, 13th Dimension, building the perfect Superman origin, 13 questions to
yeah.
construct the ideal version
That
of the
was
origin
fun.
story. It was a
That was
lot of
so
fun.
much fun.
I love doing it, and I appreciate the
That was great.
opportunity. There was one question I didn't include because I was like, well, no one ever really seems to have an issue with this. But watching the origin here in the first short, and again, it gets repeated later, they stuck with, even though at this point the Superman series had started and we had gotten our first retcon where instead of being found by a passing motorist and brought to an orphanage,
Right.
he had been found by the Kents. So that comic was already out by the time this came out, and even when they were making it. Yet
Yeah.
the Fleischer origin adheres to Action Comics #1, where the infant is found by a motorist and brought to an orphanage. I was just curious if you had any reaction to that or any take on that decision.
Other than just what you just said, I mean, I think that they. I don't know whether they. I don't know why they made the decision that they did. I guess maybe it just made it easier to tell the story as opposed to bringing the Kents into it and bringing up his life. And they just get right to it. Okay, here's guy. He comes from this planet. It explodes, and the rocket comes here, and he grows up, and here's Superman. And so let's just dispense with this as quickly as possible. In this, again, these are not about character studies. These are not. I mean, and many of the things that we're talking about are things that are done for convenience, or just done. I mean, they weren't sitting there saying faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, thinking, oh, they're going to still be saying this in 80 years. It's just good words. It's a good intro. It's good writing. It's punchy. And so they did it, and it works as an intro. And lo and behold, it becomes, part of essential Superman lore. Um, and I think that's a lot of it. Also, is that we can't forget that they were making this up as they were going along. So the consistency between what they were doing in the comics, which were moving at a more rapid pace than the animation, is it's just so much of you see that everything now is like with the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become a thing that has been planned to within an inch of its life, and which we knew was eventually going to happen. And I think actually it's suffering for that. But this stuff is like, well, all right, this looks good. Let's try this out. That's okay. And there it is. It's beautiful and it works. And some of it worked and lasted, and some of it didn't.
No, it's true, and I think that probably does account for it, the efficiency. Part of me is like, were they just purists and they were like, no, we adhere to the original Action
I,
Comics number one.
I, that would be if that were the case, Anthony. I would be stunned. I think it was expedience. Get
No, I
get. Let's tell the people who don't know the Superman story because he's brand new. Here's your 60-second recap, and we don't need to get into any questions about where he was brought up. It's just he went to an orphanage and now he's here, and let's move on. And whether that was they were working from the original script and it's what that's all they were aware of or not, or whether they made a conscious decision, I don't know. And for me, it doesn't really matter because again, this is Golden Age Superman, which was always just about Superman doing stuff. It was never about his life in Smallville and all of that stuff, which was all added later in the Superman mythos anyway. With the additions of Superboy and and when all of a sudden we would start seeing stories that took place on Krypton, or Superman would find a way to somehow travel back in time and go to Krypton, and particularly when you're talking about the Mort Weisinger stuff that came later, that Silver Age world building of all of that, the Fortress of Solitude and all of the villains. I mean, that's the other thing here. There are no supervillains here. There's no. It's all mad scientists and war enemies, and you get some pretty cool other just like of the moment villains. Like I love under the one that you had just mentioned, the Underground World. I love that one. With the Birdman. I mean, that you talk about pulp, that old school. I mean, it's like I love that one, and I love the Mummy Strikes too. I think that's another. That's when they're just basically getting into pulp, and it's. I think that they were just interested in telling adventure stories that were in the genres that were popular at the time. I don't think they were giving much thought to background.
No, I agree. It's funny. You definitely got more mileage out of the famous studios versions than I did. I just for the most
Yeah.
part I didn't, and not to belabor the point. I mostly said what I wanted to say, but yeah, I just didn't find them as having the same dynamic quality or energy. And I felt like with Mummy, with Birdman, I felt like those were instances, like I was saying before, where you got more in the setup, but I didn't feel like the setup was necessarily all that interesting, and then the payoff felt a bit light or weak again compared to those bigger set pieces we had gotten in the other episodes. But I keep an open mind. I'm glad you like them. Again, I
Yeah,
don't
well,
begrudge your enjoyment.
no, and I'm a sucker for subterranean adventures anyway. So you put Superman in some cavernous world with these bird people, and I mean none of it makes any sense, but it's not supposed to. But just this idea of them going deeper and deeper into the, closer to the center of the earth or wherever they're going, and the movement of the bird people and the way Superman has to rescue them, and to me it works as well as any of the others. The only one of the 17 that I feel like is like really obviously separate from the others is the last episode, which I think is what it's a Secret Agent. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah,
Yeah.
Secret Agent. And it's just that's one where where it does feel like they started to scrimp a little bit on the animation, on the shading, on the lighting. It has a different feel to me. But I find particularly The Mummy Strikes, I find that is as I think that is an incredibly good looking cartoon. And I mean, I thought it was great before the new transfer, but the new transfer, you really, that this is one of the things that I encourage people to do is not just sit in. I mean, look, sit and watch them, enjoy them for what they are, and have a bowl of cereal while you do it, whatever you like. Um, but you should take the time for at least a couple of these to just sit and really, really just look at the backgrounds and the foregrounds and the 3D effects that they would use based on the technology they had at the time, where you basically had a foreground, a background, and then the action would be in between. And you can, what I also didn't recognize, didn't even realize until the newer version came along, is that how much pencil work, the fine line of the pencil work, and how the backgrounds were drawn, and all of that what you take for granted, the stuff that's not moving that you take for granted. It's the professionalism and artistry of these, and I don't care whether they're famous studios or Fleischer Studios. It's deeply, deeply impressive.
No, for sure. One thing that we haven't mentioned yet, going just the idea of the designs of these versions of the characters and the logo, the S, which I happen to be wearing right now, the
Yes,
Fleischer S
yeah,
with the yellow outline,
yes,
the red S, and the black background,
the
and
black background, which is great,
it's so
which is
cool.
great looking. Yeah.
It's so cool. And have you been following Superman and Lois?
No, no.
Have you? I'm
Sorry.
sure you've at least seen the images though of
Oh
him
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
with him wearing the black. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So that was such a
Yeah, and I
nice
like when
touch.
it pops up. Yeah, and it pops up on every once in a while. My son has one of those shirts that you're wearing too. And it's and also it's worth noting that if you're really into it, go track down one of the Mezco sets, with the action figure. What is it? I think it's a action figure 4-pack with Superman, Lois, Clark, and one of the mechanical monsters. And it's got a diorama, and it's really, really cool. There's not much memorabilia out there for this particular series, but that one is a must get for fans of this thing. I just as an aside, I figure it's worth noting. But yeah, that aesthetic, and I just love the red on black. I think it's great.
Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, that's the thing, for as iconic as the traditional version of the logo is, the one that we all think of
Right.
when we think Superman, there is this other variation that I think is tremendously effective, and I do love
Yeah.
whenever it pops up. And that Mesco set that you were referencing, yeah, I've been very tempted by that. It's funny because I was looking to see what other stuff has been out there with Fleischer, and I was reminded of these DC Direct, I believe, statues that had come out years ago. There was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
Superman and a Lois one as well, I believe, or a Superman carrying Lois. I might be conflating some
I
of
think
those,
I
but
think he's flying and he's carrying her. I think. I
but it
think.
it kills me because, as you know, I worked at alternate realities for many years, and it's like I remember seeing that there, and it never that this was at the point in my journey where I was like I wasn't dialed into that, and so I don't know that I
Right.
was ever even really that tempted by it, but I must have seen it a million times, and now I'm looking at the prices on eBay, and it's like, oh man, if
Yeah,
only.
I know. I
It
know.
drives me nuts. I think about
That's
that
why
too a lot. Yeah.
that's why I do recommend the Mezco one, and if you're going to do it, seize on it because they only Mezco stuff only appreciates in value, and when they're gone, they're gone. I mean, they do certain redos, but not much. I mean, not like some companies will do re-releases, but Mezco, when it comes to this stuff, I think this is going to be a one and done.
Yeah, I will. I might pull the trigger on that. The other thing too, again, just especially going back to the golden age aspect of the
Mm.
character that's on display here. I love in a lot of these, especially the early ones, we get the wrap up. Superman saves the day. He's usually flying down with the villains in one hand and Lois in the other, and then you
Yes,
see the
yeah,
headline, the wrap up headline. Superman apprehends villains, and then it says, and then vanishes. Right,
yeah,
mysterious figure vanishes. So again,
vanishes.
I love this idea. This isn't yet the Superman who's going to stop and pose and answer questions.
Right.
He just disappears, and people are like, "Who is this guy?"
Yeah. Yeah, I like that, and to the point you were saying earlier about it's that and the two-fisted golden age approach of, it's about the story, but it's also he's not all powerful. And as you mentioned, I mean, yeah, he can stop bullets and there's a ton of stuff that he can do that others can't. But when you see flamethrowers put upon him and he gets knocked back by them and he has to struggle against them, and again, like you say, he doesn't stand around long for interviews. He takes care of Lois, kind of bids her a quick adieu, and then he flies off, and the next thing you know, Clark is back. And I like that part of it. That sort of, like you said, kind of a man of mystery element to it that was much more pronounced in the Golden Age than at any other time. Because now it's, Superman is there was a comic book writer who once referred to him as Uncle Superman, which is not this version of Superman.
No, and look, I love the different flavors of Superman that
Yeah,
we
me
get
too.
across the 85 years,
Yeah,
and this one in
sure.
particular. There's something that's very appealing about that incarnation of the character. And again, like we've been saying, just this physical struggle during these episodes.
Yeah,
Again, it really stands out because you always hear these complaints about how Superman's too powerful, this and that, and you look at these stories and again, you really see him, whether it's pulling the train or trying to wrap the lamppost around the Godzilla, essentially.
yeah,
Whatever the case may be, again, stemming the tide of the volcano. You really see him. You really see him exerting himself, and
yeah,
you hold when buildings are collapsing. You're like, hold them up, and you feel him feeling the weight of them, right? And it
yeah.
just pulls you in. There's this very visceral quality.
In the very first segment, the one that's informally called the Mad Scientist, when the death ray is coming down from the top of his evil laboratory, and Superman, he starts shooting it at Metropolis, and Superman has to struggle against it. And then finally, when he's able to beat it, he basically has to fly against the beam and he's punching it as he goes. And you could tell it takes effort for him to do it, but and it knocks him back a couple of times, and then he gets up and he keeps going. And to me, that's a lot. That's a lot more interesting than him just walking up to it and pinching off the end or doing whatever. It's that struggle. It's like this is hard work, and yet he doesn't give up. I love that part of it, and him just punching at that, boom, 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 until finally he's able to tie it off at the source. But all of that is stuff that you just wouldn't see now because Superman wouldn't be threatened by something like that. It would just simply be something that he could take care of just within seconds. And I
Right.
appreciate watching the effort.
Right, like if you were to tell this story with a modern Superman, it would be a different story. The meat of it would
Yes.
would be something else. Whereas
Yeah.
here, the meat of it is him trying to
Yes.
struggling against this
Exactly.
beam. I like
Yep.
too in the electric or the magnetic telescope short where the comet is being drawn towards Earth, and he tries to stop it. He's able to take care of the smaller meteors, but that
Right.
main comet he can't, right? And so, but he figures out how to reverse the polarity of that scientist, the magnet, and repel it. And we get that great image of him, with the power cords, right, and putting them back together, and the
Yes.
electricity coursing, through him and
Yeah.
across him. It's so great. But I like that one because it really showed the limit of his physical ability, but
Yeah.
his ability to reason and to strategize and to find another way to win. I enjoyed
And
that one.
remember, yeah, and remember, this is all before Kryptonite showed up.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the other thing is that you have to establish a weakness, and the weakness was just simply that his powers were limited. He was a Superman, but he wasn't this near omnipotent god figure. He was, kind of a tough guy in a circus outfit who could do things that nobody else could do, which was enough. In 1942, that was enough.
So let's talk about this actual Blu-ray release. So
Yes.
eventually, again, Paramount had the rights. They reverted to National. I was reading a little bit of the background of this. Apparently, they neglected to renew the copyright when they were supposed to, and so these fell into
Hmm.
the public domain. So DC, Warner Brothers, like they still own the all of the original elements, masters, and all of that. But this is why we've seen so many different releases of these
Right.
cartoons over the years. as far as official Warner Brothers ones, I guess the main one has been, not the only, I suppose, but the main one has been on that anthology set, right, where they've put them out. But this was the first instance where they were really, again, restoring them the way that they did. I think they had put
Yeah, I
them
mean,
out otherwise on VHS and whatnot.
yeah. Well, there was a disc set that came out about maybe 15 years ago that is kind of used as that was sort of the official release. And before that, I think there'd been a quote unquote official release, but others were other companies that just because they got their hands on it, and sometimes they were, second or third generation versions of them. But the one that I consider to be, and again, not an expert, not a historian when it comes to this, but I consider the one with the yellow cover that has Superman, flying and carrying Lois Lane, and it's actually when you're streaming, they use that imagery still. Um, and it's great looking, and it's an official release, and it's got extras and the whole schmear. And then came this with this beautiful Blu-ray restoration, and it in and of itself, because this is why we can't have nice things, has become controversial on its own terms.
Yes, so it's a single disc set and it has all 17. It has one new featurette where they interview some current folks in the field of animation in particular, just about how innovative and groundbreaking these were. And then there were also a couple of older featurettes that had been on other Warner's releases over the years, and those are included as well. But for the shorts in particular, and I like yours, I am not an expert on this, specifically on the technical component of how they did it, but the way it's described and my understanding of it, they're 4K scans of the original negatives. So they're working with those original elements, and it's this 4K scan that then they further cleaned up. And so the result is, I think, and this is where people seem to be really split, very clean, crisp presentation of these shorts. But the flip of that is that it lacks the grain and texture, I suppose, that some of the more purists, the diehard videophiles, look for. And so as reviews, when they announced this, I think everyone was really excited, right? Warner
Yeah.
Brothers is putting out a proper release. They're restoring them. It's going to be on the
Hmm.
standalone set. I think there was a lot of excitement. And then I remember seeing the reviews start to come out that were very critical of the quality of this transfer, of this presentation. And again, the gist of it, and for anyone who is in that camp of purists, if I'm overlooking certain details, I apologize, but it's the idea that they were looking for, again, a presentation more akin to the way they originally looked on those
Yeah.
screens. That grain, that seemed to be the sticking point, that there was a lack of grain. They were cleaned up too much, was seemed to
Right.
be the heart of it, right?
Yeah, here's what I when I was putting together my review, and I reviewed it the same way that I did the Filmation Batman re-release, which was just a few months back, and it was I could take frame grabs, I could do this, that, and the other thing. I'm like, no, let's see how it looks on the couch. So I figured, this does not have to be formal. So I actually took pictures of what it looked like on the screen because modern camera, phone cameras are just as good as anything else for doing that. And I went into this with, okay, I'm going to take, I think it was, the Mechanical Monsters, 13 different frame grips, just to give you a sense of just how bright and clean these things are. And as I was putting it together, I was starting to see other reviews starting to pop up, and they were leaning hard on the no grain, and this is a problem, and I'm looking at these, and I'm trying to consider the source, and again, this is not a knock on that. I understand that there are certain things that people who are really, really hardcore into something, that there are things that they look for and things that they expect. I equate it to listening to vinyl versus listening to Spotify or listening to CDs. I'll take you back X number of years. I remember when the Beatles first were put on compact disc. This was late '80s, and I remember reading an interview with George Harrison where he said, listening to him, he says there are things in there I didn't even realize were there, because he himself, it's like you become so accustomed to listening something a certain way that all of a sudden you're hearing different things, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? I also equate it to, and it's a different discipline, but there are similarities to comic book coloring. And I look at some, like, when comic books are reprinted, whether the publishers decide to recolor them or to somehow clean up some of the artwork or tinker with it. Neil Adams is a great example, because Adams never liked the technology for coloring that existed in the 70s. The number of times, and bear with me, I will get us back on point, but this is salient. And he talked about frequently, when I would interview him about work at the time, he would always complain about the production values of the comics back in the early 70s. And what he was trying to do was basically, you know, break through some of the limitations, and to hear him tell it, where he would collaborate or sometimes give guidance to the people in the production department, who were, remember, when it came to comics, they were as good as it got at that time. But even then, it was an industry that was backwards in a lot of ways. So years later, when they would be releasing these, re-releasing Neil Adams stories, and they would have Neil Adams volumes and the Batman illustrated by Neil Adams, volumes 1 through 3, he recolored everything. And some people are aghast at that, because it doesn't have the flat colors of, say, 1971, but instead has the more computerized. I find old school coloring myself much, much cleaner and much, much more pleasant to look at. But I also understand the appeal of modern coloring. And so you have his art from 1971 with coloring from 40, 50 years later. And a lot of people resent it. They think it's similar to George Lucas tinkering or Francis Ford Coppola tinkering with greatness. And there's that, again, another eternal debate is like, whose vision wins out? Is it the viewer, or is it the artist? And some of what I was hearing about the Fleischer stuff, now to bring it back to my point, was there seemed to be this debate about what the Fleischer's intent was. And I got to tell you, there's no way we're going to really know for sure, because we know that what their intent was with the technology that they had at the time. And we know that those limitations that we see, and the grain and the quality of a lot of this, was because of that was the technology at the time. We now have different technology, and we can now see things that we didn't see before. So for me, I found this to be tremendously welcome way of seeing this. But I also kind of sensed that there was a rumbling in the hills. So I actually did something I typically don't do when I write a review of something. I actually put in a note saying, "Look, guys, I'm not an expert. I want you to know this. I'm looking at this as a fan. I'm looking at this as someone who has seen these for many years, who is, I think, reasonably well versed in what these are for an average fan." And I can't help but look at this and think, what are you looking at if you don't see that this is an improvement on what it was before? You could still watch your ones with grain if that floats your boat, but these are beautiful. The colors are incandescent. The level of detail that you see, particularly in the backgrounds and the foregrounds, and how much work went into it, I already had a great appreciation for what these looked like. I now even have an even greater appreciation of the work that went into making it look like this, because you can see so much more with these transfers. But in even acknowledging that and saying that, I did point out, it's like, look, these are what my eyes see. My eyes see it this way. Your eyes may see it differently. And when I posted the review, which is a positive review. What was controversial about it was that I said that I liked it, and the thing took off. And the thing took off, and it was that classic battle between purists, and I think I think that there is a distinction made that you can make between purists and gatekeepers. And I think because I think that in my mind, purists are purists, but because I'm a purist about some things, but I'm not going to denigrate someone else's opinion because of it. If someone prefers reading Neil Adams' artwork, or looking at Neil Adams' artwork and reading his stories with modern coloring, okay, fine, I get it. That's what your eyes are used to. It's not for me, but I'm not going to shame you for liking that. Or I'm not going to. I mean, there are people who said that Neil Adams should stop. There were people who actually felt that Neil Adams should stop doing art because it wasn't the way it looked like it did in 1972. And I'm thinking to myself, if there's a guy who deserves to do it on his own terms for as long as he possibly wants to do it, which is what he did, then it's Neil Adams. And he's the artist, and let him do what he wants and knock it off. And to me, that's the difference between being a purist and a gatekeeper, is understanding it, allowing for it. Maybe you don't like it, maybe you like a different version, so be it. But criticizing other people over the fact that they like that other version, I think, is where it goes out of bounds. And I saw a lot of that starting to develop here. And it was an interesting thing because, at the site and on the 13th Dimensions Facebook page, I do moderate the comments. I don't let anybody get anything personal. I don't. I want it to be a genial place. But I in this case, I let the comments go a little bit further than I ordinarily would, because I did want people to read the intensity of the argument that people were having over this. And at one point, in one case, I was in one respect I was surprised, and in another respect I was not surprised at all, because that's the nature of fandom. And and this goes back, Anthony, you and I think our earliest conversations, going back years now on different podcasts or just conversations we've had, have had to do with the quote unquote right way of collecting, or
Mm-hmm.
the right way of viewing something. And this, to me, put that again into sharp relief. Is like, there's to me, this is beautiful. To me, this is wonderful. If you don't like it, okay, but don't criticize the people that do. And I read that, I was carefully reading through all of the comments that had come on the site, and all of that, and just letting the debate go on. There was one comment that I let go, although I had some trepidation, because since it didn't get personal, I let it go. But it's kind of nasty. But I do think it kind of sums up one way of looking at this, and it is. Let me find the exact quote here. It is. Let's see. Here, this part you can edit out.
No, that's okay. Well, it's all right.
Okay, no. I'm just okay. Here it is. We have someone who wrote, old school animation fans are full of shit, 99%, when it comes to complaining about restorations. That's not to say there haven't been genuinely bad releases, but I would never take them at their word. And at the same time, we had other people who saying, I wouldn't pay attention to this interview, I would only listen to the experts. And then we actually had another one. My favorite of all was that someone actually wrote, I have heard very disappointing reviews of this release. So what's the truth? And I wrote, truth here is subjective. I love the way the new version looks. Others don't. Perhaps the images that I posted will help, perhaps not. I recommend the set as noted above. And that's the thing. There is no truth. This is all about opinion. This is all about what it is that you want to see. If you want to listen to vinyl, knock yourself out. If you want to listen to Spotify, knock yourself out. I think that there are valid reasons for doing both. If you want to watch the grainier version, so be it. If you want to watch a cleaned up version that looks different and looks brighter, but still is very much what it was, it's still, it certainly is not a bastardized version of these cartoons. They're brighter and cleaner and sharper, which is not something that our eyes are used to seeing. So there's also that part of it. It's like when you listen to an album, or if you have a mixtape or a playlist or whatever, and you expect to hear songs in a certain order, and then you hear that song in a different context, and the next song comes up that it's not the same one, and you're kind of cocks your head and takes you out of it. That's sort of how I feel with this. Is that I look at these and I'm like, oh, I never noticed that before. Holy crap, look at that background. Wow, look at the level of detail and the level of care that they did. And the fact that I can appreciate that even more now than I did then, how is that a bad thing? And it's, I also equate it to the Batman 66, because everything comes back to Batman 66. Is when they released their Blu-ray set a number of years ago now, and what you're seeing is not what you saw on television in 1966, because the technology is better. So you're seeing it now in a way that nobody's ever seen it. Sweat stains and all. You could see the sweat stains on the actors. You could see all of that. And I don't want to see that, I got to tell you. But I do like, on the whole, seeing that cleaner version. And I don't think that it's antiseptic like video can be. I don't see it. I don't see it as that level at all. I just see this as old school animation that just has been cleaned up. And for me, I love it.
Yeah, I enjoyed this presentation as well. It's, you unpacked a lot there, and I appreciate it. And yeah, I had seen a lot of the comments there, and I wanted to get your take on it. And I agree with the subjective aspect here, because what is the best version of this? If you are looking for as close an approximation to the way it looked on a screen in 1941, that's one thing. If it's the original intent of the Fleischers, and again, that's really kind of tough to know, and original intent based on what they had to work with now versus what they would have at their disposal, presently. Or again, just sort of, I think what the motivation seemed to be at Warner's of putting forth, again, like the cleanest, sharpest version based on the tools that we have, and probably anticipating that would be viewed favorably. And clearly it wasn't in all circles. So yes, there's definitely that subjective aspect to all of this. Now, not even to play devil's advocate, but from the reviewer's perspective, that's their job, right? They're giving their opinion, and everyone has one.
Sure,
and
of course.
And in fairness, clearly there are people who are in that purist camp who are really dialed into this, and who have certain expectations, and they want to know whether or not this meets them. And so I think the reviews are, there's definitely an important function that they're serving. Now, I think where we run into dicier territory is, number one, what you were saying about, if and when it gets personal, and sort of this idea of yucking someone's yum. It's like, if you looked at these,
I like that.
If you looked at these and you were like, these are great and I love them and I'm enjoying them, for someone to kind of, and, to whatever extent this did happen, but, whether it was in your comments or elsewhere, but, for anyone to come in and be like, you shouldn't like these, or you're wrong for liking these, that's where I think we definitely run into an issue. It's funny, not to keep going back to Super Mario Brothers, but it was generally a very well received movie and everything. But I definitely remember seeing some more critical reviews or posts, and one of the things people were saying, it was, very bare bones plot, like there wasn't much going on in the movie. And I sat there with my son, and it held his interest for 90 minutes, and that was all I needed it to do. To me, that's a great movie. But then I take a step back. But I take a step back because we recently did an episode on the Patreon here on the 2 Shazam movies. And we're fairly critical of Shazam! Fury of the Gods. However, 2 things. Number one, I would never put someone down for liking it. And also, I don't think I even said this in that episode, but I'll say it now, especially now having had the experience that I did with my son, where I can appreciate the situation where, I'm looking at Shazam! Fury of the Gods with a critical eye. I'm going to talk about it on the podcast. I have certain feelings about it. I felt like it was a huge step down from the first movie. But at the same time, I can take a step back, and I can imagine a scenario where a dad or a parent or whoever takes their 10 or 12-year-old to see that. And that 12-year-old has a great time, because I think that movie is probably like right on the mark for that age group. And they have a great time, and they look at that movie as this wonderful movie and wonderful experience. I can appreciate that, and I wouldn't want to take away from that, right? So, everyone is looking for something different out of these things. Everyone is bringing their own baggage and their own perspective to these things. So again, it is important. Now, the last thing that I want to say about this, because this is kind of more the strategy or the potential implications of things like this. One of the things that I saw was a number of people saying that they were canceling their pre-orders after these reviews. I saw a number of instances of this. I can't remember offhand if one of the reviews even said, like, if the reviewer said they were canceling a pre-order, or if it was more.
Yeah, something like, I've seen a couple of those. Yeah.
Now, here's the thing, and I feel like this cuts both ways. On the one hand, I am a proponent of you vote with your wallet, and you shouldn't buy something or feel like you have to buy something if it doesn't match what you want it to be. So I do get that. At the same time, going back to what we were saying about the Filmation, right? Why one of the reasons why I bought that Filmation Batman was I hope that it prompts Warner Brothers to release Filmation Superman. And
Right.
so I guess for those who canceled, their feeling is, hey, I'm sending a message that this isn't up to the standards that it should be. So I'm canceling my order, and maybe this will make you do better next time. My fear is that the takeaway instead will be, oh, well, F this, like we just won't do this next time. Like there
Right.
won't be a restoration, there won't be a new release. And so that's where I feel like the potential danger lies in, in that thinking, but more specifically that kind of response. I mean, again, I'm not saying like, oh, you should buy it if you don't believe in it, but at the same time,
Right.
I don't know, as what I'm getting at is I don't know if canceling the pre-orders for those who did is going to yield the result that they think.
Right. I think there's a very fine line there, and I think that you're right. Look, the whole point of reviews is caveat emptor. That is the reason reviews exist. The whole idea is that experts are, or people who are purported experts are supposed to tell you what it is about this and whether or not you should save your money to do something else. I mean, that's really at the heart of it is what a lot of this is. So that is why reviews are important. That's why it makes a lot of sense. And I get it. Like if I see a movie that I might be interested in, and if there's a consensus that says, "Is this movie kind of sucks?" Well, then I'm going to save my money for a different movie. This is, I think, different because it smacks of gatekeeping as opposed to, like I said, being a purist. There's an edge to it. There's a if you don't see it our way, then you're doing it wrong quality to a lot of this. Not everybody by any stretch, but to jump off of what you just said, I also saw people on Facebook um, who were posting, like they said, I read all of these reviews that said that this was junk, but I love it. I gave it a try, and that was, I thought, was really interesting. That there were others who, and again, it's what are you looking for? And I think that what a lot of people forget, and what a lot of people don't understand anymore, and again, I could go on and on about this, and I'm not going to, but the distinction that people don't make anymore between opinion and fact, and considering the source. Okay, if you look at a hardcore video file review that takes an approach that leans heavily on the technical and leans heavily into areas that are, like you said, I think that the intent is right, purism and preserving the artistry of something, and that's fine. But as a viewer or a reader, you should take into account, okay, that's for that segment of the community. For the rest of us who want to see something that maybe is cleaner and nicer and brighter, take that into account too. And then make your own decision about what's right and what's wrong. And it's that edge of, if you don't agree with my opinion, then your opinion is wrong, or you're wrong for liking this, or you just don't understand. No, I understand. I may not understand all of the technical aspects that went into something, but I do know what my eyes, tell me. And my eyes tell me that this is beautiful and this is beautiful. And they are beautiful for different reasons, and that's okay. And that, again, is something that I always want to try to go back to at 13th Dimension, is that I know what I love. And that's why I don't write negative reviews. If I don't like something, I just won't talk about it. I mean, I might make a snarky comment here and there or whatever, but I don't like to make anybody feel, like you said, yuck someone's yum. This is what you like? Fine. This is what, and this goes back to the point where someone says, well, what's the truth? Well, the truth is what it is. It depends on who you are. It's an opinion. The truth is to you what you feel it is and what it is that you are looking for. If you are looking for grain and, that more, a golden age 1940s look, then fine. At least you still have those chances. If you're looking for something cleaner, if you want to look at it in a different way, for me, I think it's an improvement, then you've got that too. And I think just cooling down the level of rhetoric that goes into these things is one of the important things. And
Yeah,
it's,
look,
unfortunately, we don't see enough of it.
no, that's the thing. And again, as we started with this, right? We appreciate everyone's passion and try to spin
Yeah.
it as a positive, that I think ultimately
Yeah.
it's starting from that point. I guess I would feel bad if there were someone who, especially if there was someone who had never seen these and
Right.
had been looking at this as the opportunity to finally check them out, and
Yeah.
then saw some of these reviews and were turned off by it, and now just has not watched them. That to
Right.
me would be a real
Yeah.
shame. And so I don't know that this is necessarily the case, people who are listening to this show, but if anyone hasn't watched these, and in particular, if you're on the fence about this particular release, I think you now have a good sense, and you can hopefully answer for yourself what you're looking for, right? What type of
Yeah.
viewing experience you're looking for. But I would say, especially if you have not seen them, if you're not familiar with these, my personal feeling is this is a great set to pick up. I mean, I have them on the various other sets that Warner's has put out, but I wanted to see what they did with this one. And to be honest, and this is like so lazy, but I was like, it'd be nice to just have it on one disc, like just one quick
Yeah.
set, as opposed to like,
Yeah.
because they're on a couple of discs on the other ones, and I was like, I just want to have like
Right.
just a standalone set, could lend it to someone. So I recommend it, but keep in mind there are other perspectives out there, and there are certain issues that people have flagged, but we enjoyed
And
this.
and keep in mind that in this particular case, it's not the case with all of them, is that they were also released digitally. So you could buy one episode and judge for yourself whether it's something that you like. You don't have to buy all 17, and you don't have to spend the $25 or whatever. You could spend $2 or $3, pick an episode and say, do I like this? Does this look the way I would, is this entertaining to me? And if it is, take it from there. And if it's not, don't. And it's the it's it's the you're doing it wrong thing that I don't like. And I look at it this way. I am not an expert about animation, but I kind of would like to say that I have learned eyes. I have been looking at this stuff for most of my life. I have been not studying. I mean, certain things, of course, in comics I have studied, but when it comes to animation, I haven't. But at the same time, I do know what my eyes like. It's like the old thing is like, I don't know what I don't know if it's art, but I know what I like. And and in this particular case, I look at it as, this is simply, you need to judge for yourself. You don't have to take my opinion of it as a more of a fan. You don't have to take a videophile's opinion of it. Judge for yourself. That's why I put the frame grabs. Look at the frame grabs. If that appeals to you, great. If it doesn't, great. But just don't rain on someone else's parade. That's not cool.
Exactly. So be cool, everybody. So listen, we're closing in on 2 hours here. So a couple of things.
Oh my
A,
God.
I want to thank you for this conversation. It was great to be able to talk about these episodes, and I'm so glad that I did an episode on it when I wasn't sure that I would. But I'm glad I didn't do one sooner. This was a great time and a great moment to do it. I encourage everyone to check out 13thdimension.com and to follow along on social media. I know your Facebook page in particular, you're very active on there, 13th Dimension. You're also on Twitter as well. Not as much
Well, I mean,
anymore.
my account's active, but I don't use it anymore.
All right. So
Twitter's
Facebook and the
just,
site would probably be the two best
yeah.
places for people to go.
Yep.
Audience, I appreciate you tuning in. As always, we're going to be off next week for 4th of July, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with a discussion of Superman and Lois Season 3. That's our last episode before we get into our massive multi-part Red Skies event, where we look at all of the crisis level DC events. Dan is going to be back for the first episode of that. So I hope you will tune in. I hope you'll enjoy. To kind of send us out of this episode, you might have given a firm answer on this before, but just for the record, do you have a single favorite of these 17 theatrical shorts?
Yeah, Volcano.
Okay.
I love it. Yeah, I mean there are a number of others that I love nearly as much. I mentioned 11th Hour and some of the other, but Volcano, to me, I love the look of it. Just all those bright colors and the way everything moves. That's the one that it's not one that is it's not quintessential. I think the quintessential episode is probably the Mechanical Monsters, the one that everybody refers to and seems to know the best. But Volcano for me is the one.
Right on. It is a great one. For me, like I said earlier, $1 Billion Limited. There's something about Superman and that runaway train and struggling to haul it and getting pelted with the tear gas. All of it, I just thought was really pretty thrilling and engrossing. So that was the one that stood out to me. But audience, I would love to hear from you. What was your favorite of these Fleischer /famous shorts? please reach out. Let me know. Again, thank you as always. Thank you, Dan. And make sure you come back in 2 weeks for our next all-new episode. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.